Is the DSLR dead? I'm not quite willing to say that yet, but has mirrorless eclipsed it to the point where it makes it easier for me to create better images with these cameras? Yes. Let's look at why. What's up everyone, Hudson here. I'm looking forward to a spirited discussion in the YouTube comments and probably some emails as a result of this video. I've had a number of people emailing me or hitting me up in the comments that are just diehard DSLR users, aficionados, and they're, nothing will ever equal the optical viewfinder experience, and taking me on from my wholehearted embracing of the mirrorless future. And I think that while DSLRs aren't dead, the D850 is one of the finest cameras I've ever used, as is my Nikon D500, as is my friend David's D5. But the future is clearly mirrorless, and there's a bunch of good reasons for that. And the companies have clearly taken note and are embracing a different path. And we'll talk through some of the reasons. The discussion reminds me a little bit about the film versus digital revolution that I went through, 20 years ago. So we'll talk a little bit about that and kind of my history with this, because I used to be one of you. I used to say, mirrorless just can't cut it. I'm an optical viewfinder guy. And I'll talk about what changed my mind and why. So first, I want to invite everyone to the office hours August 24th, right before our first post-COVID workshop with Hudson Henry Photography on the Oregon South Coast. We have a full awesome crew going down to one of the most beautiful places on earth. And I want to talk about workshops and the workshop experience. And while I know it's not for everyone, we'll talk about what's so great about it. I'd love for people to share their good and bad workshop experiences. We'll talk about how we're handling it in the age of COVID's kind of resurgence with the Delta variant, a whole bunch of interesting stuff to talk about. So sign up at hudsonhenry.com/office hours. You can leave a question there. I'd love for you to join us on Zoom so we can see all your faces, but it's also going to be on YouTube Live and it'll be archived there if you want to watch it later. All right. So, one more quick announcement. My good friend Rick LePage, who helps me teach workshops, helps co-lead, and also is always in the office hours, just published Ben Long's new book, The Practicing Photographer. We hit on that a little bit in the office hours last week. It's an awesome book, and I'm going to put a link to go check it out at Rick's website, Complete Digital Photography, in the YouTube description, along with a chaptered out table of contents talking about all the different, pieces of this video I'm about to talk about. You can jump in, watch or rewatch any section that you want. Those are linked, chaptered out, time-coded table of contents in the video's description, along with links to everything I'm talking about. And when you go to those links, hudsonhenry.com/ATS links, I keep that updated all the time with the gear that I'm using and the gear that I approve. And those links help me out, and I really appreciate your using them. It helps support the content that I create. All right, everybody. So let's back up for me to back when I was a mirrorless skeptic, running a workshop in Mount Rainier National Park in the fall of 2018, not that long ago. And I literally, the night before the workshop started, we had this cool crew of people on kind of a foggy Mount Rainier first day of the workshop. And in the middle of the night, I woke up to the email that the Z6 and Z7 had launched. And I literally pre-ordered a Z6 with the thought that I would test it, decide I didn't like it, just like all the Sony products that I was using at the time, and send it back. And here's the video I made talking about that in the fall of 2018. Here's a clip. So one of the interesting things in this workshop was that more than half the students showed up with mirrorless cameras, and Sony kind of predominated. We had some compact sensors, we had some full frame Sony sensors, and David and I we're holdouts, we're still DSLR shooters. I shoot with the Sony system. Well, I have an A7S and I have an A6500, and I've spent a lot of time now with the A7R III, different friends that have it and workshop participants. And at this point, for me, I don't know about you, David, that they feel a little small in my hand, and I'm prone to changing settings accidentally that I didn't mean to, the way the buttons and the switches are laid out on it. And I'm not as comfortable autofocusing still. I know that they've gotten a lot better, but it still just feels a little unwieldy to me. And I don't know about you. Have you?
Yeah, it doesn't seem intuitive to me. But
Yeah.
I haven't spent a lot of time with it, but so
far.
Initially.
Well, and David's a big wildlife shooter, so we really need to be hearing about the autofocus getting to the same point as the autofocus systems in the Nikons and the Canons. I mean, I think still when we look at sidelines of the big pro sporting events where they don't have to be silent, you're seeing predominantly Nikons and Canons down there. The D5, like David likes to carry for bird photography. And you know, I know Nikon has had the big announcement with the Z6 and the Z7 bodies coming out very, very soon. I went ahead and pre-ordered a Z6 because I already have a Nikon D850. I think that's about the same sensor that's in the D7. It doesn't have some of the functions that I love on my D850. It costs a little bit more. Its battery life is less. You know, but I want to see what the new mirrorless form factor feels like, and I don't have a 24 megapixel full frame at this point. I'm shooting with the D500 and the D850. David, I know you're not pre-ordering it yet.
Not yet.
He's going to wait and see what I think of mine before he fully pulls the trigger.
I'm usually a pretty early adopter. But
oh, David, name me the Nikon bodies that you own at this moment.
See, I have the D4S, the D5, the D500, the D850.
Yeah, you've got pretty much, yeah. He doesn't skip too many new things from Nikon that are interesting. So I'm going to check out the D6 or the Z6, and I'm not likely to get it until, I don't think they're releasing that one until sometime in November is what I'm hearing. So it'll be a little while, but I'll definitely let everyone know what I think of it when it arrives. All right, so you can see that my friend David and I were mightily skeptical of whether a mirrorless camera could pull us away from our favorite DSLRs at the time, the D5, the D850, the D500. I felt like I had the dream combo in the D850 and the D500, and I could never want for more. And that's usually the moment when you should start wondering about your assumptions when you say something like that. I've said that about mountain bikes in the past, and then 8 years later I pick up a new one, I'm like, oh my gosh, it's so much better. I can't imagine going back to the old one. Well, fast forward to the spring of 2019. Just a few short months later, I was on a workshop again with David in Charleston, South Carolina, where we photographed a lot of birds and wildlife. We go to the South Carolina Birds of Prey Rehabilitation Center, and they fly birds for us. So we do a lot of birds in flight photography when we run the Charleston workshops. And my good friend DC Offutt brought his brand new Sony A9. David had the D5, DC had the Sony A9. We decided to do a little head-to-head testing. And I'll show you a clip from that. We got a ton of great weather. We've been out photographing birds. We were at the Center for Birds of Prey. We've been in old downtown Charleston. We've eaten good food. We've drank some good beer, eaten some good pizza, had all kinds of great food, and lots of nice weather. We've got a kind of a cloudy, rainy day here in Beidler Forest, which is an amazing, natural, old growth cypress swamp that the Audubon Society maintains. And I want to talk a little bit today about the fact that we've had DC with his Sony A9 and David's got his Nikon D5. And so we're kind of looking at what are the two top gun, high speed, badass autofocus cameras. And we've been photographing birds in flight, and we've been doing it at the same time. And all three of us have shot both cameras. Now DC's native to the Sony system. How long have you been shooting Sony?
Years.
Yeah. And David's been shooting Nikon probably nearly as long as I have. Yeah. And you don't lack too many Nikon toys.
Not too many.
Although he hasn't picked up any of the Z cameras like I have, but he may after.
I'm a holdout.
He's a holdout. So it was interesting pitting the kind of pinnacle of optical autofocus against the pinnacle of mirrorless autofocus. And I gotta say, I'm gonna show some images and some sequences. DC shot this spectacled owl. He's the native Sony shooter at 20 frames a second with the brand new autofocus that you picked up just before coming on the workshop, the new firmware, the new firmware update for it. David's, how many frames a second? 12. So it's a deficit already, but neither camera seems to miss very many shots. And I was photographing with my D500, which has the same autofocus system as this, but a slower frame rate, 10 frames a second, which I used to think was just amazing. And I got to say, this whole time we've been working out there, you're like framing something up, and then you hear DC just go. It's like a little fan. And I got to say, I have been skeptical of whether the mirrorless could keep up with the best of optical. But David, what are your thoughts, having shot both of them?
I don't know. The mirrorless is much better than I anticipated.
Personally, I mean, I have no problem getting every frame, well, most every frame sharp with either system. The interesting thing is that stepping into the Sony with, you know, I picked it up, let DC let me use this beast a little bit. It was dead simple. I mean, tracking is dead simple. And I would say that if you're not someone who's spent a lot of time learning to do perfect autofocus with the optical system, you're going to step in and get every frame sharp and in focus easier with this new mirrorless system. All right, well, slight backstory to that clip is that I had had the Z6 for a while at that point, and I decided that I would use it sort of exclusively for a while and just get used to it, get a feel for it, and I was blown away by the quality improvement in the viewfinder. I had noticed that the new Sony A7 III had a much nicer viewfinder than any electronic viewfinder I'd used in the past. It seemed almost like the difference between an old tube TV and the latest 4K TVs, just a huge difference where it almost felt crisper and brighter than life and vivid colors and fast refresh rates. The Z6 felt the same way to me. I was still getting used to the autofocus system and some of the control changes and layouts. And the early version of the Z6 and Z7 were a little bit crippled with autofocus until they came out with firmware version 3.0. But I had that camera for a bit, and in going to Cuba with my family to preview a workshop that I was going to teach in Cuba, I decided I would only bring the Nikon Z6 and the Nikon Z7 with the FTZ adapter, and the only lens I had at that time for the Z system was the 24-70 f4, which I found shockingly sharp. I had started to kind of become enamored with the Z system and had actually made the decision, you know what, I'm only gonna take it to Cuba, which is a big choice. Cuba is a place I had dreamed of going. It was my first trip there with my family, spending a bunch of time previewing locations for a workshop and photographing. And here is the intro to that video that I shot while in Cuba to just talk about my experience there. And here are some of the images I was able to capture with the Z system. Hudson Henry here. This is approaching the scene, and I just want to take you on a little tour of how spectacular Cuba is. All right, so video and stills with the Z system I found wonderful. I found particularly in Havana, working at night in the streets, those city street scenes at dark and the dim light, suddenly I'm noticing that shooting through this electronic viewfinder, I'm continuing to have a nice bright view like I'm in daylight. I'm not squinting into a dark viewfinder. Stopping down to check aperture, it's increasing ISO through my viewfinder, and I'm seeing things bright even as I'm stopping down with the depth of field preview. All of these things, keeping a nice bright viewfinder. The ability, as I'm getting older, I have 20/10 vision at distance, but I really need reading glasses. I can't really focus on anything further than arm's length away. And so with the DSLR, I would go to focus in live view really, really accurately, and I have to put on reading glasses, flip it into live view, zoom in on the back of the camera. That's tripod only work. With the mirrorless camera, I found myself, even in dark situations, just tapping a button on the back while looking through the viewfinder and zooming into 100% on that portion of the frame where my focus point is set, and dialing in manual focus perfectly with peeking in the viewfinder. Wow. Just like, holy crap, this is amazing. Changing menu settings and everything through the viewfinder, reviewing images and zooming in to check focus through the viewfinder, which is diopter adjusted for my close vision issues. So suddenly the reading glasses just stayed in my camera backpack. I'm not pulling them out all the time. The ability to quickly change a setting like bracketing by programming a button and just turning 2 dials while not taking my eye out of the viewfinder to watch the settings, and then fire off bursts with pop, pop, firing one frame on the meter, one frame 3 stopped underexposed. All these kinds of things I could just do quickly without ever taking my eye back to look at the viewfinder, let alone get reading glasses out of my pack and look at the back. And I just, I started using it more and more. And a couple of months went by, and I decided, oh, well, I'll take the D850 out on a shoot. And I found myself shooting a shot, hitting play, and going, oh, wait, no, I have to. Oh, yeah, that's the image. Now let's zoom in. All these extra movements that I had to do. And then as Nikon fixed firmware 3.0, all of a sudden, the eye detect autofocus became incredibly accurate. Its ability to just pick up faces and automatically detect what it is that I'm tracking and focus on it, it's almost as if it's a lot like the revolution between center-weighted metering, where you needed to really use your brain in situations like snowy scenes and places like that and sort of know where the meter is going to get fooled, and matrix metering and evaluative metering in Canon and Sony coming to full fruition, where the camera is so smart it just rarely misses an exposure. You don't need to be second guessing what the meter is doing. Just every now and then check and make sure you're not blowing highlights out. The autofocus system in these newest mirrorless cameras is absolutely getting there. That's what I really noticed with doing the back-to-back shooting with Nikon D5 and DC's Sony A9 was like, wow, this thing is autofocusing like a dream. There's almost no blackout. Now, you know, everybody's still coming up to steam with these. Canon and Nikon were late. Sony's obviously had 4 generations of camera. Their autofocus system is slightly more evolved when it comes to sports and action and wildlife. You know, those things where you have a small object floating around the frame. I find that with frame filling action, Sony's new R5 and Nikon Z6 II and Z7 II do an absolutely stellar job. You know, I often grab my 500 PF f-mount lens with the FTZ adapter on it and slap it on either the Z6 II or Z7 II or the Z6 or Z7 and get an incredible keeper rate, you know, shooting, say, kiteboarding at the coast. I have a whole video about that that I'll link in the video's description, where, you know, once you've got frame filling action, this autofocus system just doesn't miss. It just like any system, I think you bog down a little bit when you have something that's a little too small and you're going to need to do a whole ton of cropping. And if it's erratic motion like a bird in flight, much more complicated. If you have the right lens and you're really filling the frame, at least, you know, a quarter of the frame with the subject that you're photographing, you're going to find that any of these cameras do a miraculous job. Sony's a little bit better at small objects with erratic motion. There's no doubt about it. Sony's also a little bit better at not having any blackout between frames when you're shooting with the EVF. I was just shooting with my good friend Rick LePage's Sony A9 over the last few weeks. And it's really quite amazing shooting action and wildlife with it. But that doesn't mean that the Nikon or the Canon are bad. You know, I was able to get just about as great a keeper rate once I practiced with either of these cameras. I would say the Sony's a little easier out of the box right now, but they're all coming up. And the future is clearly with this intelligent recognizing subjects on the sensor and letting the computer make an analysis of what it is that you want in focus. And then you can override it by establishing a tracking point if you need to. You sort of have to revert to the old way with the DSLR only when the computer isn't picking up on what it is that you're photographing. And the future's clearly in the computer picking up on what it is that you're photographing. And if it has a face or an eye, detecting that and locking in on that face or eye so that you don't even have to think about it, it just locks it. You know, shooting portraits with these cameras or images of my kids running around my yard at full speed, just amazing. You know, the keeper ratio is mind-bending. It just doesn't miss. All the eyes are in focus. And it's dead automatic. So between the ability to see in low light situations, the autofocus picking up subjects and automatically choosing and focusing them for you with an override that you can easily accomplish, you just have to learn the system. It's a little bit different than DSLRs. So a lot of people, I think, become frustrated when they first make the switch because they want to use it like they did their DSLR and they don't take enough time to really spend with it and figure out how it's different. And once they do, they realize, oh wow, this is actually better. The other thing is that for still subjects, you know, landscapes or still lifes or macro, you're going to find the autofocus vastly more accurate. And with the newer lenses on the newer bodies, far less need to calibrate your autofocus. It's just right. I keep running Rican's Focal software on my mirrorless system and finding that it's plus or minus 1. It's really negligible, the need to even calibrate these lenses. That's not so true when you put an F-mount older lens on the new system. They just don't seem to be quite as tight a tolerance. But amazingly, you know, the mirrorless, by focusing, by seeing contrast lines on the sensor, it's not like it's calibrating an optical rangefinder with the actual lens down below and having to have those two systems calibrated. It's one system, so there's a lot less room for error. Low light autofocus on all the brands is just phenomenal. The whole scene brightens up, it takes a little extra time, and I'm actually finding I can focus on planets and bright stars on moonless nights doing Milky Way work. It's just stellar. It's incredible. And I can see those in the mirrorless EVF, which I could never see in the optical viewfinder. You don't see stars in an optical viewfinder. When I was shooting Milky Way and things with the D850, before dark, I would have all the students in my workshop focus in at infinity with the lens they were going to use, at the focal length they're going to use, and then gaff tape it so that the focus ring couldn't move. And then we'd shoot the Milky Way set up like that. You know, it's just so hard to focus in low light situations through an optical viewfinder. With the digital, you actually can just focus it out at infinity. And finally, and this is a huge deal, is the lens quality. You know, right here, I have the D850. Well, you know, one more thing. Size and weight, I think that's oft overstated. You know, I'm really enjoying this, the Canon R5. It's like a mini 5D, you know, Mark IV, whichever one you want to talk about. It's just scaled down a little bit. It is a little bit smaller, but it's still, you know, if you're shooting with a full frame camera, full frame glass is going to be heavy. It's not the biggest weight savings. I actually just weighed my Z7 II with the brand new 105 S macro lens, the MC, up against the D850, which is essentially the same sensor, with the 105 2.8 F mount macro lens. And it's about a pound difference. It's bulkier in the camera bag, no two ways about that. But it's only about a pound difference. You know, it's not the end of the world. These things are lighter and smaller, but what really does make a huge difference is the quality of the lenses. Just last week I did a video about this, or maybe the week before, about this 105 2.8 macro, the new S lens, and how it compared to the macro lenses of old. And it's exemplary of all of the new Nikon S glass that I've used. It just blows the old F mount equivalents clean out of the water. You know, the new 14 to 24 2.8 actually is a fair bit smaller and lighter. You pair this up with the Z7 II and you gain a couple of pounds over an 850 with the old 14 to 24. And it's sharper at every aperture, significantly sharper from wide open to f4. I mean, a lot sharper, and the edge to edge is just razor. No chromatic aberration, where the old f-mount lens had tons of coma and lateral chromatic aberration, especially wide open and low light scenes. The other thing, you know, they're not always smaller though. That's not universal. The new 1.850 for the Z system, the S mount, is significantly bigger than the old 1.850 for the F mount system. But again, optically, way better at every single aperture. You know, the testing I just did in the last video, I'll give you a little teaser in case you don't click on that link. This new 2.8 105 macro lens is sharper from wide open to f13 than any aperture at all on the old f-mount lens. So at the sharpest f-mount aperture doesn't match any of the aperture measurements from wide open to f13 on this new version. That's what we're talking about here. And Nikon and Canon both seem to have made it a point to kind of lean on having their old pro glass, like the 500 PF and their big primes and their older F glass that's legendary and really great, with a really solid adapter that makes it work just fine with the new Z mount cameras, and building new lenses that are light and incredible performing. You know, I think part of the secret is, you know, it doesn't have to have the projection go all the way through that deep mirror box. There's no mirror box, it's just straight to the sensor. So the flange distance is really short. Nikon's actually got the shortest flange distance in the business, so you can adapt anyone else's lenses to it. And then there's just how big and wide this mount is. That was a really smart move on Nikon's part to make the biggest, widest mount. Canon also has a really wide mount. It's not quite as wide as Nikon, but when you compare this wide mount to the old F mount, I mean, it's just dramatically wider mount. And that is letting their engineers do incredible optical things. So like I said earlier in this video, the 24 to 70 f4 lens just blows my mind. I've never carried 24 to 70 lenses because the 2.8s are so big and so heavy. And I like, you know, sometimes I would just carry maybe a 35 and a 50 or a 20 and a 50 and have my 14 to 24 and my 70 to 200 and kind of bridge that gap with a couple of nice low light primes, just because I didn't want to carry that big old heavy lens. But this little f4 is such an amazing knockaround lens on the Z system, and it's just incredible optical quality, wide open, even in the corners. And the same thing can be said of this 14 to 30 f4. I can't wait to see what happens when they come out with a 70 to 200 f4. I don't see it on the roadmap yet, but I kind of think it's neat that they're doing the 100 to 400 on the roadmap before it, because that'll actually be a little bit more useful. The R5 that I've been testing that B&H has lent me is an incredible camera too. You know, if you're a Canon shooter and you've been on the fence about whether I should buy, you know, a new 5D or should I buy the R5, go R5. You're gonna love it. It's an incredible camera. It's great with its autofocus. Its eye detect is wonderful. It's a joy to shoot with. The layout and controls are really well thought out. And some of the new glass that they're making for this mount is just incredible. I love this 70 to 200 f4 that they have. It's so great, wide open from 70 all the way to 200. It just doesn't make very many compromises. It's small, fits easily in your bag. I mean, a great camera. And I haven't shot a whole bunch of the lenses, but everything I hear from everyone is just incredible. It's got a great viewfinder too. So, I mean, I just think that all the R&D, all the future production is heading for mirrorless for good reason. It's just flat easier to use. You know, the final note I'll make is on quality and durability. That was always a little bit suspect with me with Sony. Now, shooting with the A1, it feels really solid. Now, clearly I haven't taken Rick's $6,500 camera out and beaten it in rough conditions and salt water and all kinds of things like that. But I trust in Nikon and Canon. I haven't tested the R5 either. This is on loan to me. I'm gonna have to send this back to B&H. And I'll put a link to all this stuff in the video's description, including a B&H link. I'm really thankful to them for letting me borrow and use this cool camera. I've just been super curious about it. And I'm gonna do some videos comparing the three cameras where we'll really go through where each one has its strengths and each one has its weaknesses. And all three, the A1, the R5, the Z7 II, are really quite incredible cameras. They each have strengths and weaknesses. None of it, shooting all three, makes me want to switch brands. I think whichever brand you're familiar with and love and are used to and it's muscle memory to use, you can bet on any of them. They're all doing great work, and you can capture stunning images on any of them. The quality and durability of this, I wondered about in the beginning, and I have a video from the summer of 2019, about 6 months into using these cameras pretty exclusively, where I accidentally tested that, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Today, I want to show you a dramatic example of just how brutally weather resistant and built tough the Nikon Z6 and Z7 are. We had some accidental testing of that on the workshop that I taught here in Bandon, Oregon, on Oregon's southern coast this weekend. I had a great workshop crew. Thanks to everybody that came out. We had a really marvelous time. We had some high winds. We had some brutally clear skies that we worked Sunstar and these rocks and sea stacks. And we had some clouds and some breaks with a little bit of color, and we had a really crazy night at Thor's Well, and that's what I want to talk about. We got to Thor's Well. It was a little bit before high tide, a high tide. That's this killer tide pool cavern that does a kind of a pumping action as the waves come into the rock and it blows up out, and it's a really spectacular thing to photograph. And it was a pretty light action going on in there. We'd stayed in there a while. I was watching the waves, and I felt comfortable getting a little bit closer to it than I might normally, because it wasn't a very high tide. And I had some of the people in the workshop that were pretty experienced seafaring folks watching for a big wave for me. I was watching for a big wave, and I got kind of close to it in a spot I like to get where I can capture the coast and the headland behind it as a background. Most people, if you stay back where it's a little bit safer to photograph it from, you know, the only real viewpoint is the sea behind it. And I remember my good friend Brian Matish following me to capture a shot of that headland one year and getting significantly wet in the process. So I was being a little bit careful. You know, I had this Arc'teryx jacket with my hood up, thankfully. I was photographing with my Z7 on my tall Gitzo tripod. I figured if a wave came up, it really wasn't gonna get me. We had a very strong north wind blowing, and I was standing to the south of it, so I knew if anything big came up, I was gonna get drenched. Well, oddly enough, you know, I'm photographing, I'm getting some interesting shots. You know, what happens is the water comes blowing up out of it, and as it floods the surface of that hole in the rock, then it falls back down, and you photograph that waterfall action as the water falls back down. And it's very dramatic and beautiful. You want a longer shutter speed, maybe a half a second. So I'm photographing it, and just a weird combination of waves. Something happened with like the direction that the waves came in, maybe two smaller waves at once, but it blew up right as I was photographing. And I had the I shot as it was coming into me and then tried to put my hand in front of the lens, but it completely obliterated me. I'll show you some shots here. I'll link them into the video that my friend Rebecca, who was on the workshop, captured of it happening to me. I mean, it was literally as if my camera and I had 30 gallons of seawater just thrown over us. And I just immediately picked up the camera, walked out of the zone, you know, traipsing across that rock. And luckily I had my Camelback in my bag. And here's how weather resistant the Nikon Z7 is. I've got the Z7 that this happened to. I took my Camelback and literally just immediately started pouring fresh water over the entire surface of the camera. I completely hosed it down immediately with fresh water because salt water is so corrosive. I opened the back screen, pulled fresh water in there, just hosed it down. I'm comfortable doing that for you on video because I did it out there, dried it off with a microfiber cloth, let it dry in the wind for a minute. Luckily, this jacket is relatively DWR coated. These Arc'teryx Atom jackets, I can attest to. I had some Patagonia alpine climbing pants. I stayed dry. I was dry in just a few seconds in the wind, actually. Camera dried in the wind. I kept shooting all night long, all the next day. There was never a hiccup with this camera. When I got home that night, of course, you know, I rinsed my tripod out in the shower. I wiped this down with a sopping wet towel. Completely let it sit by the air conditioner through the night in the hotel just to dehumidify. And I'll do that again in the van on my drive home to Portland from here today. But never a hiccup with this camera. The weather sealing is amazing. It was the 24-70 f4 on there at the time. You know, of course I opened it up, poured water right into that lens barrel like I'm doing right now. Make sure you guys can see. No problem whatsoever. All right, so you know the weather sealing is good. I've also had a couple of students accidentally have tripods go down with Z cameras on them and seen them take some really awful, nasty hits on rocks and bounce right back, no repairs needed. I shot with the same Z7 for several years after doing that video where it got saltwater and freshwater immersed. Never a hiccup, never a problem, never a glitch. So to me, the mirrorless revolution is very, very real for good reason. You know, I did this video right before I'm going to sell this D850 on MPB.com, which is a website I've found for selling camera gear. I'm going to actually do a little video on that because it's a great experience. And I'm going to be basically selling everything I have F-mount except for lenses like the 500 PF, the 300 PF, and the 105 1.4 that aren't replicated quite yet in the Z ecosystem. It's just an incredible system. It has, you know, I'm always saying it's more about your practice as a photographer, how much you know about photography, learning to see, learning to make critical decisions, learning to be creative. That's what makes you a great photographer. The tools are very, very secondary. But in this debate about DSLR versus mirrorless, the whole debate just seems to me very, very familiar. It's a lot like I heard when I was first shooting digital and the film photographers were just disrespecting it, saying, oh, it's not really photography. Real photography is still film. Digital will never replace film. And I think that debate's long past. And I don't think it'll be too long before the mirrorless versus DSLR debate seems very, very similar in everyone's minds. And the one big thing I would say to any of you considering major purchases right now is hold off a little bit. This next generation of cameras coming is very, very exciting. And I think that the lenses that are here for the mirrorless systems, whether you're talking about Fuji, Sony, Canon, Nikon, but particularly for you Canon and Nikon DSLR, you know, stalwarts, hold off buying new F-glass. I think you're going to find that every single, or the EOS glass, you know, look at the R mount, look at the RF mount, look at the Z mount lenses, compare their statistics, their sharpness, their lack of chromatic aberration, their lack of distortion, their, vignetting, everything is better about these new lenses with the short flange distances and the wider flanges. I think you're going to find that the future is with these lenses, and you can always adapt your old F glass or your old, Canon EOS glass right on to the new mirrorless cameras with an adapter. It's just extending it out and replacing that mirror box that's not there in the mirrorless system. You can't go the other way. You can't possibly use these new amazing lenses on your old DSLR, and that's a real loss, particularly when you consider a gem like this new 14-24 2.8S lens, which is clearly my favorite lens I've ever shot with. So those are my thoughts, those are my reasons. If you're still unconvinced, hey, there's nothing wrong with these cameras. You can create a fantastic image within the limitations of the glass, and it was more than adequate in the past. I just don't think they're going to be building it into the future. So you're sort of limiting yourself with the available technology moving forward. All right, with all that said, I'm sure there'll be a lively discussion surrounding some of this. I am always easy to get a hold of. I love being part of that discussion. Leave your comments here on YouTube, email me, hit me up however you want to. Again, office hours on the 24th of this month, August. It's going to be talk about workshops, good experiences, bad experiences. How are we handling workshops moving forward in COVID? What's our plans for the next couple of years? What are questions some of you have? Maybe you think workshops are just a waste of time. Well, I'll try to disavow of that opinion. Workshops are one of the things that really boosted me as a photographer when I was young, working with others who I looked up to and making friends and just joining the community of photographers. Workshop's a great way to do that. We'll talk about that stuff. So join me on Zoom, join me on YouTube Live, hudsonhenry.com/office hours. Again, links to everything I'm talking about here and more are both in the video's description and at hudsonhenry.com/ATS links. All right, everybody. I hope everyone's staying safe. It's a little bit rough with the resurgence out there. I hope everyone's vaccinated. Everybody in my family except my littles are, and that makes me a little stressed out given everything that's happening. But I hope everyone is staying safe, staying creative, staying upbeat. We'll all get through this, and I hope to be out photographing with you all soon. Take care. See you next week.